It is all right. We are now live, so please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Once again, I'd like to welcome the first prop speaker to begin the debate. Yahya.
Hi, just to double check, can I be heard and seen fine?
Yes, all is good.
Perfect, thank you. Two things in this speech. One, why we help the most vulnerable groups on our side of the house. And secondly, why we protect individual motivation on our side as well. Before that, what's our stance? One, we support a world in which success and failures are seen as a consequence of random factors instead of personal actions. What does this mean? We think that this debate is about success and failure, which means that this debate is probably not about the daily actions of individuals, because success isn't a day-to-day thing, right? It's the conclusion of a process. For example, whether or not you got promotion rather than whether or not you go to work. Two, this debate is not absolute. It isn't 100% randomness on our side of the house versus 100% personal actions on their side. Why? Because we think on both sides of the house, there are just things you cannot explain without the use of randomness or hard work or personal actions. For example, if an individual gets cancer, right, you can't attribute that to personal action. Similarly, if you don't show up to work and you get fired, that isn't random, but rather as a result of your action to not show up. This debate is about what narrative we want to prioritize to the people, and we think that we have to rebalance the status quo that we see right now. Thirdly, know that randomness is distinct from luck, which is to say an individual can be lucky, but an individual cannot be randomly. This is because no other possible factor can influence randomness because nobody can control it, period. This is therefore statistically, randomness always results in a 50-50 odds in an action, but we think this isn't necessarily the case for an individual who is lucky. Before I jump into my arguments, I just want to know, objectively speaking, how much of failure and success is due to random factors, in the first place. This is because firstly, your locus of control as one individual in a company, in a few hundred, a city of a few million, a world of billions of people is very, very small. Therefore, anything you decide to do has to interact with the rest of society whom you have no control over to have a big impact. Therefore, how the rest of society acts, like whether you meet an investor who is willing to take a risk with you, is largely arbitrary. Second, historical inequality creates structural barriers to personal action, which is to say it doesn't matter how hard you work if you go to an underfunded school. It doesn't matter how much you want to succeed if your parents can't afford health insurance or can't afford your college tuition, for example, on their side of the house. Well, that said, first off, what we help the most vulnerable? There are a couple of layers under this. The first is that note that this is a prefers motion, right? This isn't about how we perceive these factors in the status quo, but also about how we perceive these factors historically. We think on their side, the idea of personal action resulting in success has justified some of the most egregious actions in history. This looks like the white man's burdens, for example, which is used to justify European colonialism in Africa and the Americas by arguing that Europeans industrialized sooner due to the fact that they are the ones who individually acted to subscribe to Protestantism and adopted capitalism instead of quote-unquote more problematic cultures. This is what justified things like racism, things like slavery, because it was the idea that these people who were white were not personally, who weren't white, were not personally capable of making good actions on their side. Conversely, on our side, the superior industrialization of the West would have been ascribed to random factors instead of personal actions. For example, we support the hypothesis forwarded in Guns, Germs, and Steel, which states that geographical randomness gave the Europeans access to more natural resources and more arable land, which allowed them to achieve food security sooner. Therefore, on our side, we can see that colonialism might have happened either way. But we think to the extent at which the European success was not due to the superior personal action, but arbitrariness, the worst visceral forms of action, such as slavery, would not have happened. This is because in order to supersede the moral intuitions of empathy and viscerality, European leaders needed to justify why to enslave and why they kill. On proposition, we remove the justification they have used in the status quo, and that's why we decrease the likelihood of these things happening. Two, the problem in the status quo on their side is that the rich people ascribe their personal success to their actions rather than some randomness that must have helped them along the way. Therefore, they self-perpetuate the idea that they were rich because they deserve to be rich. That is when they perpetuate narratives such as poor people are lazy or African Americans are lazy, for example. This is likely to be fixed on our side for two reasons. Firstly, if rich people believe that their wealth is due to randomness, then that they will also fear that randomness might work against them in the future and make them poor. Therefore, in order to make themselves feel secure, there's a personal incentive to support things such as greater social security and the expansion of the welfare state by paying more progressive taxes so that they have a safety net if randomness randomness works against them in the future. But second, rich people cannot self-justify their wealth anymore because it's not due to their personal actions, but rather to random factors that were largely out of their control. This when conservative parties can no longer perpetuate the notion that policies like welfare is unjustified because poor people are simply lazy. They have less political capital to reject these policies on their side. We think the impact of this argument is huge. It means that the state has more money for healthcare, for education, and a bunch of other infrastructural developments that literally saves lives and solves structural issues that underfunded schools for minority groups because rich people in the status quo send their kids to private school. This means that individuals on the ground have a much more equal chance of succeeding, and individuals on the ground are much more likely to be able to do so on our side. Secondly, while we protect individual motivations, before I move on, I'll take that POI.
So European colonizers also used the narrative that they were God's chosen one, which feeds off of your narrative. So surely people in power will do whatever best for them and use these narratives for whatever's best for them.
Yeah, we agree, but we remove one of the biggest reasons as to why they do this on their side. But secondly, note that just because they're God's people doesn't mean that they're like more, like there's a higher chance of them being randomly advantageous, right? Like we think randomness is 50-50 in nature, and that's why they cannot use those justifications on our side. Second, why we protect individual motivation. The thesis of this argument is that individuals are just more likely to fail than succeed. Why is this true? One, all the reasons I gave you at the offset of my speech about the locus of control being small and historical impacts. Two, the fact that success is zero sum. This to say if someone gets a promotion or gets into a school, you don't. This is going to get worse over time through population expansion, for example. Three, there's a hedonic treadmill effect. Even if individuals aren't objectively failing, individuals see it as failing on their side because one, they've been acclimatized to good things you get in life, but you cannot get acclimatized to the bad things. For example, if you work in a decent office job, you get acclimatized to the office conditions, but you cannot get acclimatized by the, like, for example, like being starving. Secondly, you actively compare yourself against others who are more successful than you. Therefore, we think what's the most important for an individual is how they recover from failures in life, because failure is a bigger inevitability than success. On their side, we think people cannot take failure well. We have a couple of reasons for this. The first is the idea that you can work harder next time or act in a different way has a cap on it. That's to say, if you fail after working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, you physically cannot work harder. Comparatively, there's no cap to randomness. You cannot be randomly unlucky like for the rest of your life, because that's just not how randomness works statistically, right? The second is that failure on their side is completely personal. It's about your personal actions instead of uncontrollable things. We think that this leads to learned helplessness, where people just believe that they're incapable of acting in a good way, so they stop aspiring for more because they tried their hardest and still can't succeed. What are the impacts of this? One, we think you get overworking and burnout on their side of the house. This is because people believe that personal actions such as working hard leads to success, and therefore will push themselves over the limit until they succeed. We think this is exactly what happens to desk workers literally passing out in their keyboards in many Asian countries, because they push themselves so hard to work more than the other workers so that you can succeed. But also, after a period of intense hard work, people are likely to be burned out when they see they still haven't succeeded from their personal actions. We think this is uniquely bad because this means on their side of the house, individuals are unlikely to take opportunities when they come to them because they can't be bothered or tired. But they also just see themselves as stupid. They see themselves with less social value because they aren't able to succeed in the long run, even by following the formula that society has been giving them, right? We think this is what leads to a lot of mental health issues in the status quo with self-esteem, when people feel as though they are the problem themselves and not because of society as a whole. We think that on our side, you take sustainable motivation for a long period of time. This is because when individuals fail, they think they were on the short end of the randomness stick and might be on the long end next time. They're likely to try again in a capacity that doesn't overwork themselves. Ultimately, we think this is beneficial to the average individual because when people work and try for a long consecutive period of time, we think eventually they're much more likely to achieve success. So by their own metrics, we're much more likely to achieve success on our side of the house, and therefore we're very, very proud to stand on proposition.
I thank the P1 for that speech, and now to begin the case for the opposition, welcome the O1. Yeah.
Thank you. Just another reminder, I'd like POIs in the chat, please. Cool. Panel, women would not have been able to be emancipated had it not been for their belief in the individual action. If the feminist movement didn't believe that the possibility of change was in their own hands, they wouldn't have gone out to protest day after day, despite the obstacles they faced. Propositions world creates a deterministic view for minorities, that arbitrary factors are always against you. We tell you not only is this incredibly demotivating, but it is also actively harmful towards minorities. Before I respond to what we heard from the Prime Minister, I want to do a bit of framing on who is most affected by this narrative. There are two parts here. Firstly, note that the most privileged in society already have such random factors in favor of them. For instance, the wealthy family you were born into, or the fact that you are the dominant race in your area. Therefore, we tell you under this narrative, even if randomly they are favored, they are still more likely to take chances. What this means that these are the individuals that are more likely to apply to top schools, that are constantly fighting for bigger promotions. They are the ones that are more likely to outcompete the underprivileged. The second part to this framing then is for underprivileged individuals. We tell you these are the individuals that likely have random factors stacked against them. This is the very this is what the Prime Minister refers to as the structural factors. We tell you this narrative makes them feel like success is hopeless because they will never succeed. I want to also note that in the status quo, alternative narratives already tell certain vulnerable communities that there are structural factors against them. The feminist movement already tells women that they live in a patriarchal system. There exists historically sexist gender norms. What this then means is that under propositions world, you add a further narrative, which now tells them that you have absolutely no chance of ever succeeding because everything that ever happens to you is determined randomly. That not only do you already have these structural factors, but now all of your success is out of your control. We tell you that is when minorities are most likely to give up. Moving on to rebuttal then. The first argument the Prime Minister brings to us is the idea of how they help the most vulnerable groups. I think the biggest problem with this argument is that it's just not comparative, right? Firstly, they tell us that terrible historic events would happen. We tell you the reason why, for instance, the Netherlands colonized Indonesia was not because of the reasons they give you. It was far more concrete. It was because they wanted land and they wanted resources. Under whatever narrative, the Netherlands would have had a poor justification for invading Indonesia, and they would have done it anyways. But moreover, they tell us richer people will now care about the poor. I think most people understand that it was largely random. You were born into a rich family. I think it's also quite easy for the rich to get richer. They don't really contextualize how this randomness will suddenly work against the rich, like why Jeff Bezos will suddenly lose all his billions or trillions. I'm also not sure why the rich will buy into this. I don't think they do enough legwork for this point. But moving on to their second argument then on how people end up becoming burnt out and demotivated. We tell you the reason why people are burnt out is because in the examples they give you, like in China, where you work 12 hours a day for 6 days a week, they do it because they need to put food on the table, because they need a salary, because they live in a capitalist system that tells them you continuously need hard work. This narrative doesn't necessarily change anything. The difference then in our world is that people are more likely to reach their goals under this capitalist narrative, because in their world, when you do believe that all your success and failure is deemed by your individual action, that is when you're more likely to reflect on what your goals are. That is when you are more likely to reflect on what mistakes you've made and how you can change. We tell you that is when you're most likely to succeed, and that was when you're most likely to be motivated. Moving on to our case now on why our narrative is better for minorities. But before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Your response to our case is that people realize that there are random factors that inhibit them from succeeding. If this is your response to our case, doesn't it concede that randomness and the perception that things are random is a good thing?
No, because this is exactly what I'm proving in our speech, especially for the most vulnerable groups within this debate. The randomness is the very reason, when they believe this is the very reason why their lives will be more miserable. Why do we think then minorities are less likely to work hard on their side of the house? Note that there are unique costs to working hard. It costs money, it costs time, it costs effort. And this is something people only really want to do at the moment in which they believe that it's likely to be effective. Minorities are likely to already know that the deck is stacked against them. This narrative tells them that succeeding is completely out of their control and that whatever they do doesn't matter because it's always stacked against you. This means that people are less likely to be willing to accept these costs. Why do we think then in our world, people are likely to work harder? There are two reasons for this. Firstly, when your success is determined by your personal actions, you're more likely to want to work towards your goal the moment in which you feel like it is something very concrete in your hands. But secondly, people generally set realistic goals for themselves. Note that we're oftentimes our harshest critics, and from our past experiences, we probably know what we want to aim for. Therefore, you're more likely to be motivated in our world because you feel like your goal is something you can reach. In propositions world, even if your goal is reachable, the exact narrative they tell you is that it's always out of your control. We tell you the lack of clarity means that individuals are far less likely to want to take action to begin with, to even try for that promotion. Why do we think then that we are more likely to succeed? Note that as opposition, we don't have to promise extreme changes, such as who becomes the next president. But we honestly believe that change can occur for minorities. In the status quo, more and more countries are recognizing the rights of the queer community. More and more women are participating in the workforce. We tell the reason why this trend is occurring is because of the relentless efforts of these minority communities who refuse to give up, who go out on street day after day to protest, who stand back up every time they get pushed down. In our world, we can still break the glass ceiling. Why do we think that even in the case that you fail, you're still better off on our side? We tell you there are 3 reasons for this. Firstly, note that failure and success are largely subjective. So when the Prime Minister says success is something that doesn't happen day to day, we reject that. We tell you if you're protesting for abortion rights and your protest gets shut down by the police halfway through, that may seem like a failure to a certain extent, but because you were able to, for instance, find a group of young women that stood for the same beliefs as you, now you've made new friends. In our world, smaller successes still count, but moreover, they seem more valuable in our world because you personally played a role in that, because we tell you that you were the ones that were able to connect with individuals on that level that was able to make friends. What this then means is that even if we have smaller successes in our world, it is still largely more valuable and more motivating for people. Secondly, we tell you in a case that when people have largely failed, they may be self-critical, but in our world, we still give them more hope. The reason for this is very simple. When you tell people that everything is in your control, even if you failed once, you still tell them there's always a possibility for you to succeed the second time because you could have done it anyways. This means that even if the status quo is terrible, you're more likely to be able to live with it because you know that it is only temporary. Given that both sides of the house are unable to change the systemic or structural factors anyways, we tell you life for minorities are probably better on our side. But thirdly, on our side, when you do succeed, you're 10 times more motivated and more recognized. Let's say both sides are symmetric. Let's say minorities will find it difficult to succeed on both sides of the house. In Proposition's best case, when minorities do succeed, they will never get credited. That as a woman, people will believe you only got that promotion because your employer thought you were attractive. That as a person of color, you only got into college because you were lucky. None of your accomplishments will ever be taken seriously in Proposition's world. We tell you that is also incredibly demotivating and harmful for minorities. The impact here is very simple. Perhaps there are structural factors that exist, but on our side of the house, that doesn't mean climbing the social ladder is impossible because we can get smaller change. This looks like getting a job, which may not be much in the grand scheme of things, but that can still be an individual success because now at least you're able to put food on the table to provide for your family. Opposition merely tells people that they should never even try to apply for that job because as a minority, not only do you have structural factors against you, but everything is random anyways. But also note that we get more change from the ground up. So over time, we can still build up to getting bigger changes. The fact that once you as a minority have successfully opened your own business, you're more likely to hire other minorities. We tell you at the end of the day, we are able to protect the most vulnerable group in this debate. I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition first for that speech. And now to continue the proposition case, welcome the P2. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, looks good.
The opposition characterizes the impact of randomness very oddly because they say because something is random, you are utterly unmotivated. I think it's actually the opposite. If something is random, me and somebody in a position of power are characterized to have an equal chance of getting success, of achieving certain goals. That is inherently empowering because that is equality. On their side, if everything is based on personal actions, that is when inequity occurs because some individuals who are in positions of power have more access to courses of actions. You feel like everything is blamed on yourself, so if you don't succeed, you blame yourself. Randomness is inherently empowering because it tells you you can succeed and the chances exist. So even if you fail a few times, you still believe at some point you will succeed. So already that flips the bulk of their analysis. With that said, there's 2 big questions I want to ask. One, how does this narrative influence individuals? And secondly, on societal inequalities. Under both of these metrics, we can prove to you why our side is much better. One, how do we influence individuals? There's 2 things under this. First, on the motivating factor, opposition literally concedes all the harms because they say people in China overwork because they want to achieve goals. That uniquely happens on their side because if you believe everything is based on your personal hard work, you will push yourself to the very limit. We think that is inherently a bad thing because it is a hedonic treadmill that also influences everyone. So if everyone in society wants to work extra hard, that is a system that pushes people to work 72 hours a week. That is a bad system. Already on the comparative, on our side, if everyone works a little bit less hard, that is still better because you aren't working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, as we see in the case of China. Their side drives people to overwork. I don't see why that super hard work is already a good thing on their side. Furthermore, the only mechanism is then we can reflect on certain things, but they don't prove why reflecting on your own personal actions leads to better outcomes. I would argue reflection probably doesn't lead to that many good outcomes because it's very hard to say exactly what you have done leads to success, right? So let's say you don't get the promotion. Why is it on their side you can suddenly reflect on what you've done and do much better? We think it's much more likely that you look back on what you've done, you think you need to work harder, so you push yourself towards a limit. That's a bad thing. Now, on both sides, people want to achieve goals, right? So their idea of, small goals, achievable goals probably will still exist on our side because individuals are still incentivized to achieve things. But the difference is on their side, when everything is based on personal action, you are more likely to blame yourself. That is bad because as you have characterized you in first, in the majority of cases, you don't succeed because society is extremely competitive. You are against a lot of other individuals. So on that way up, I would argue it is better to not blame yourself already. Our side therefore allows individuals to be more motivated and have less self-blame because if you can say, this was random, I'll make it next time because it is random, maybe I'll be luckier next time. On that way up, you're less likely to blame yourself and say, I didn't work hard enough, I'm not a good enough student. That is in itself a very large impact because self-blame is a huge harm that we see in many cases. People blame themselves in very depressive states because they don't get into a good university when inherently it was very arbitrary. Now, at their best, in the short run, we think you might have more motivation, right? Because you think everything is based on hard work. But still, as we have characterized you, in most cases, you won't succeed. Success takes many, many tries to achieve a good outcome. It might take many, many years before you get that dream job you want. On their side, you are likely to burn out because you associate that with your own action. So if you push yourself to the very limit, you did everything you can to get that job and you still don't get it, you are stuck. Because I've done everything I can and I still cannot succeed. And if everything is based on personal action, you tell yourself you have no actual way of achieving those goals. That's what you burn out. We think our side is much better because even if you don't work as hard in the short run, you are more sustainable and you work for a longer period of time because you can tell yourself, this was random, I'll get it next time, eventually I will succeed. That's what on our side where people don't blame themselves, but also achieve success. On the way up, it's already much better because as we told you, most goals do take a long period of time to achieve. Now, at their very, very best, let's say everybody works much harder. The biggest problem is the capacity to accept success in society is the same. The amount of CEO roles, the amount of good university spots are the same. So even if everyone works hard and pushes themselves to the limit, on their side, most people will still fail. They are much worse off on their side because everyone already pushed themselves to the limit. So on their side, the amount of self-blame is absolutely enormous. On our side, if everyone works less hard, you also don't blame yourself as much, which is a much better reality because it means you pick yourself up and continue to achieve other goals because you want to work towards them. But secondly, the impact of self-blame is also not as big because on their side, most people are probably going to blame themselves because they cannot achieve success. So they were unable to prove that this extreme level of hard work is a good thing. We flip it by telling you the majority of people are going to be better off if you feel better about yourself, even if you don't succeed in the very worst case, because you can assure yourself it was random, it's not based on yourself. You don't have the harm of self-blame. That's crucial. Secondly, on social action, Atlas already outframed the majority of their argumentation, right? Because we told you randomness is supposed to be 50-50. So if you look into a corporate system, let's say 80% of promotions are men, that clearly is not a random system, that is a skewed system. Therefore, you're likely to call that out. They also conceded on their side there are mechanisms to get social change. So for that reason, it's unclear why on our side people are going to suddenly give up on social change. Because one, they concede an awareness of structural issues. So you want to achieve those goals on either side of the house, right? So all of our motivation factors about long-term change also apply. So we already proved to you right off the bat why on our side we get sustainable motivation to get social change. That's important because social change often does take a very long period of time. On their side, if there's no quick action, you're likely to burn out and get short-term stints of motivation. But secondly, believing in randomness, as we told you, is empowering because you think the goal could be achieved. On their side, if you believe everything is personal action, if you feel you're disenfranchised, if you don't have enough resources, you are never motivated to actually go out and protest because of all the structural barriers that they concede exist. On our side, if it's random, you are much more motivated. So in terms of social change, we are also much more likely to get it. That flips the bulk of their analysis. Now, that proves why on our side, individuals are more motivated and better off. Let's talk about societal inequalities. But before I move on, I'll take a POI if there is one.
If people believe that regardless of what they will do, the chance of any outcome happening is 50-50, why is there any incentive to risk working on that anyways?
We told you that the goals are similar, right? And that there is a random nature, but you still need to do things to work towards a goal. If you just don't go to work, you aren't working towards a goal, you've done nothing, right? So there is no necessary success or failure in that case. If you want to achieve a goal, you still have to do some degree of legwork, right? So even if people work less hard, it's not like they won't do absolutely nothing. You still have other incentives, as we told you in first. Now, on societal inequalities. One, what they argue, which is accomplishment is not associated to individuals. We're going to flip this, right? Because their narrative is essentially women are blamed because they say, their narratives for example, you slept with your boss, therefore you got a promotion. That's more likely to happen on their side because no, their mechanism is individual action. So, a negative narrative like sleeping with your boss is an individual action, right? So you can still blame that personal action on their side that still exists. On our side, if it's random, people say, okay, you got promoted, I didn't get promoted. That's a random nature. So on our side, there's less blame. We flip the argument very easily. Secondly, on social equity, this was an entire argument we gave you to which the only response we heard was they didn't do enough legwork. That's not argumentation. We did do a lot of argumentation. So all of these impactings actually go through, right? Things like, for example, better taxation systems, because in general, it's much easier to hold the rich accountable because it's no longer they worked hard so they deserve the money. It's they were very random, right? For example, the reason Bill Gates is so rich is because he was born at the exact right time in the right school in the right environment. With that narrative, it's much easier to tax people because you don't say all their money is based on their hard work. Secondly, we get more safety nets. That's crucially important because it benefits everyone, right? Because if you think you can fail the next day, you want to protect yourself. 3, there's also systems of guilt where you feel like there's imposter syndrome that you succeeded, so you're more likely to give back. All these mechanisms have massive impact on society. It's insufficient for them to just respond by saying that doesn't exist. So we get all those impacts very easily. They need to respond in the next speech, or else they already got outweighed in most cases. 3, in the justification for extreme discrimination, once again, we never hear a proper response. All we heard is they will use other systems of discrimination. We have a couple of points of response to that. 1, incentive might be parallel, but ability isn't, right? And that maybe their example of Netherlands will still go and colonize could exist. But later on, it's harder to justify a long-term oppression because when you need to justify to your public why slavery is acceptable, on their side, there's much more ability to do so because you can say we are a superior race and you can use technically scientific ideas to promote that. On our side of things are random in nature, it's much more difficult to justify that. Something like, for example, we are God's people is very difficult to substantiate. Saying that we had the Industrial Revolution, so we are better is an easier justification. So we already prove mechanistically on our side, we take away a crucial tool for oppression. But secondly, once again, our side is defending randomness, right? So we told you in general, that's just much weaker justification. So already there is a clear delta there. Even if the delta is not that big, it is still a very large impact because even if, for example, there's 10 less years of slavery in a country, that is still a huge impact on a very large group of people. So that impacting still goes through. Their response is insufficient. So at the end of the debate, we prove that individuals are much better, much more motivated, and don't burn out. And also on societal level, we get more equity. For all these reasons, vote for the proposition.
I thank the P2 for that speech. And now to continue the opposition case, welcome the O2. Yeah.
Hi. I'm presuming I'm still audible. Quick reminder, I would like POIs in the chat, please. And without further ado, I'll start my speech. The vast majority of the proposition case hinges on one claim about what the motion means. They say that randomness will always be 50-50, and thus that this motion gives them the fiat to say that everyone will interpret it that way. This is how they say that rich people will want to invest in social welfare and in taxing systems, and how people who are in impoverished situations are likely to think that at some point in time there's hope at the end of the tunnel. The problem here is threefold. We think there are reasons as to why people are likely to create their own logic from randomness. Firstly, because of your lived experience. So even if you think that there are random factors which affect you, if you are someone who lives in poverty, abject poverty for your entire life, without much volatility, where you didn't ever suddenly become significantly wealthier than you previously were, then you're probably going to think that there's some kind of structure behind that randomness, which means that if you're at this starting point, then you're unlikely to have a 50-50 chance of suddenly becoming very rich. Secondly, because people find meaning behind structures which would otherwise seem random. This is why a lot of people, for instance, convert to religion when they previously weren't, or why a lot of atheist people still consider themselves agnostic, simply because people don't like the lack of comfort which comes from not knowing what exactly the meaning is behind broader structures. So even if people think that they're completely random, they're completely random events which are completely beyond their control, people tend to externalize that and create some kind of logic behind it. Thirdly and lastly, people generally like externalizing blame for the situations in which they are, simply because people find it hard to blame themselves for every single fault that they make. I'll get more into that in terms of the motivation. But broadly, I'm going to talk about two ideas then. Firstly, in terms of marginalized individuals and the degree to which you get systemic reform. And secondly, I'm going to talk about motivation and the degree to which people feel happy in their life. So firstly, in terms of the most marginalized groups within society, I'd like to make a note about the opposition case. Opposition's core assertion is that basically, when it comes to systems of power, those will only ever be changed by the goodwill of the powerful. Historically, this has never been true. The civil rights movement in America didn't come from the goodwill of white, powerful Americans. It came from demanding rights from figures like Martin Luther King. A couple of things here. Firstly, they say that colonialism was based on the narrative which is in use on our side of the house. Two things here. Firstly, in a POI, we already know that this is historically untrue. The same narratives which proposition talks about, that being that random factors affect people's space in society, are also used. Just purely that means that when you get the long end of the stick, that makes you morally better. But secondly, people in power will pick and choose what's most convenient for them at that period in time. They can see them themselves. But thirdly and lastly, even if you need to justify the narratives, especially retrospectively, as the second proposition speaker speaks about, it's significantly easier on proposition side of the house. Why? Because you remove all personal responsibility for the actions that individuals took at that point in time, rather than the way in which these came about was all through like pure random luck from the universe, and thus that no specific individuals and no specific institutions can be held responsible for that. Secondly, they say that in the modern day, rich and powerful individuals are more likely to support the poor on their side of the house. Three things here. Firstly, note that this broadly takes place in purely in the developed world, because in most of the developing world, there just isn't the possibility to have broad scale welfare systems, just because there isn't enough state funds, or because there are just too many individuals to help, or because the vast majority of people live in rural areas where it's hard to support them. So even if this argument is true, it's on an international scale rather small in impact. Secondly, note that even if they prove that the rich are more likely to lobby for instance, reforms in welfare systems, that takes forever. It takes forever to get it past Congress. It's oftentimes very small incremental change, where sure, maybe you get plus 1% every couple of decades. That doesn't take a huge impact on individuals' lives. But thirdly and lastly, even if there was the possibility for rich and powerful people to improve systems in the short run over a broad scale of the world, we tell you that this is unlikely that they'll do so on propositions of the House. Firstly, they say that there's a fear for randomness hurting them, so therefore they want to create broad scale welfare systems to support themselves in that event. Firstly, note that we already explained why individuals oftentimes find logic within this randomness. So if you're a person who's been rather rich your entire life, then it's probably quite reasonable for you to expect that you're on the long end of the stick instead of the short end. But secondly, we tell you that individuals have a massive positivity bias. Even if you think it's 50-50, you can never imagine yourself, especially when in your entire life you've been on the long end of the stick, that you'll ever go to the short end of the stick. It's so incredibly intangible to you that you won't really be able to internalize the consequences. Secondly, even then, if individuals do believe that at some point in the time they make up the short end of the stick, just the way off isn't worth it for them. I'll take the POI after this, by the way, because even if you believe that at some point in time there's a 50% chance that you'll be significantly less wealthy than you are now, that's all uncertain. Whereas now you know that you have large degrees of wealth and power, so it's so it's not worth it for you to give up large portions of that, because then the randomness in the future wouldn't matter either way. It wouldn't change. You would still have the short end of the stick, so you might as well the long end of the stick while you still have it. Secondly, they say that you must help the poor more because you can't justify your wallet. Firstly, I don't think rich people particularly need to justify their wallet. Like, there's no reason why that. They have all the power, so they don't need to justify it to anyone. But secondly, I say that on their side of the house, you can justify your wallet even more. Why? Because the playing field is completely equal. You could have this amount of money regardless, and there's no systemic pressure pressuring you either way. It's completely 50-50. Lastly, even if all this was true, firstly, no, I will skip that. Basically, on our side of the house, we say that systemic reforms come from the bottom up. Before I go into that, I'll take a POI.
So even if we assume that your characterization of the motion is correct, that the arbitrariness is from birth rather than your action, isn't it far more empowering to explain to Congress that you couldn't succeed because you're born in a poor neighborhood rather than you don't work hard enough?
Okay, so it isn't recharacterizing the motion. It's purely about the idea that individuals will create their own logic around their perspective and what randomness means. But secondly, I find it unlikely that individuals are going to go up to their Congress members and then tell them that they're in systems, they're disenfranchised. Even if people would want to do that, I don't know why people would do that on either side of the house. I've already explained why the rich are unlikely to want to do this, regardless of whether or not they feel like they are personally responsible for their own wealth. Then we basically just say that on our side of the house, people are more likely to want to and to be able to take action. They say people want to achieve their goals either way, and that on their side of the house get stable pressure. There are two reasons as to why individuals don't take action on proposition side of the house. Firstly, because individuals don't think that they will be able to change anything, that their actions don't matter. Sure, they say that you still need to work towards a goal for it, That if you think that there's just a completely random chance that any specific event is going to happen, then you don't feel the need to personally work for it. But secondly, even if you believe that it does need personal work, then you might as well think that any of the other huge amount of other individuals who live in the same oppressive structures are going to work towards it as well. They'll all have 50% chances, so you don't need to sacrifice yourself to do so. On our side of the house, we encourage individuals to say that they are the ones which need to take action over their own lives to marginally improve their own situation. That brings us to our second constructive about motivation. They say individuals internalize their blame and that individuals are likely to overwork. I think neither of these are particularly likely. Firstly, because individuals tend not to want to think bad about themselves and tend to externalize the blame wherever or not, regardless of the societal narrative. But secondly, individuals tend to have the closest individuals around them tend to be individuals who take supportive roles rather than negative roles, so your friends and your family. But thirdly and lastly, we still live in a capitalist society in which capitalists don't want to overwork you to the extent to which you get burnt out. That's why HR departments and things like that exist. Overall, we explain that on our side of the house, we give people these small successes in their life. So sure, broadly you might be impoverished, but you can still take satisfaction in the fact that you were the one who worked towards bettering your own life. That you are the one who created the savings that you could get your children to go to nursery, so that you could go to see friends. Overall, this is really a side which allows people to take power of their own lives. You should vote for us.
I would like to thank the O2 for that speech, and now to conclude the substantive portion of the prop, welcome the P3. Yeah.
Hello, may I begin?
Yes.
The prerequisite to opposition case, ironically, is the belief that randomness matters. Because African Americans would not participate in the BLM movement if they didn't believe that they were dealt a bad hand because they were Black instead of the fact that they didn't work hard. BLM would have never existed on their side of the house because people believe that their failures were due to their own personal decisions instead of the fact that the birth lottery and the random nature of it made them born with the wrong color of the skin in a racist society. So the prerequisite to the existence of social movements is the belief that randomness matters, which is what we have on our side of the house. I want to clarify two things at the top. One, randomness is more broad than what side opposition wants to say. Randomness isn't just a birth lottery, but rather the likelihood of success throughout the course of your life, right? So it isn't just the likelihood of success when you protest, it is also the likelihood of success when you work hard, or the likelihood of success when you do a bunch of other things. Two, if second opposition wants to respond to our case by saying people will pick and choose different beliefs, then this debate completely washes out, right? Because if everyone just picks and chooses, then there's no impact, right? Some people on our side of the house will pick randomness, some people on our side of the house will pick hard work. On their side of the house, some people pick randomness, other people will hard work. There's no delta if everyone just picks and chooses their own beliefs. I want to talk about three things in my speech. First, on historical injustice. Second, about fixing inequality in the status quo. Third, about the individual perception of themselves. First, let's talk about historical injustice. This clash is important for two reasons. One, it's a proposed motion, so it's about an alternative conception of history. Two, this impact of our historical injustice is bigger than their impact, because their impact is that minorities are more likely to protest. But the reason why they are protesting is because of the fact that there were historical injustices that were inflicted upon them. So in terms of timeline, historical injustices come upstream of the present protests that they want to talk about. They say that historical injustice would have happened either way because colonizers would have found other forms of justification. Two responses. One, the contingency of their argument is to prove that people are inherently evil. They don't prove that people are inherently evil. We don't think people are inherently evil. We think people want to do good. People want to be good people, or else they won't be able to live with themselves. Therefore, the people who did evil things in the past did evil things, not because they're evil, but because they were able to guise their evil actions behind a belief that they're doing the right thing. The guise of beneficiality happens on their side of the house because it is easier to justify colonialism. It is easier to justify slavery. It is easier to justify the white man's burden if you believe that your superior European technology is due to your personal actions, is due to the fact that you chose to industrialize instead of the fact that it was geographical luck or some other factor. Second response, even if incentive is symmetric, ability isn't, right? So maybe you as a Cecil Rhodes has an incentive to get people to support slavery and colonialism, but your ability to do so is reduced because on our house, we take out the largest tool they have historically, which was the belief that white people were better than non-white people through the choices of white people. Therefore, on our side, they get rid of that notion. Therefore, you're likely to solve the worst forms of colonialism like slavery. This is a huge argument because even if colonialism exists on either side, the basic forms of the worst excesses of colonialism that go against our basic moral intuitions would not be justified due to the fact that it was geographic luck that got white people what they got instead of the fact that they worked harder or instead of the fact that they chose to become Christians. Second class then, let's talk about fixing inequality in a status quo. First thing to note is a matter of weighing. Rich and powerful people have more political and economic power than poor and vulnerable people. This weighing is important because all of their mechanisms pertain to how poor and vulnerable people will act. They say they're more likely to protest if they believe that their protests and their individual actions can do something. This is outweighed by our impact, which is rich and powerful people are more likely to support social work for themselves. Rich people supporting something has a bigger impact than poor people supporting something because rich people just have more power. Their response is no, but rich people can just pick and choose. Two responses. One, the choice that rich people can pick between are value systems that exist in society, right? Therefore, the value systems that exist in society on their side of the house are things like meritocracy, right? Therefore, more rich people are likely to be able to adopt and opt into meritocracy. On our side of the house, when value systems, which are premised off of belief, are more arbitrary and more like random in nature instead of meritocratic in nature, that is when rich people cannot pick and choose systems that support them to the same extent, insofar as there's just less systems that support them if most systems are built off of the belief in randomness. Second, this debate completely washes that everyone can just pick and choose, right? So there's no delta here. Why do we change the incentives of the rich and powerful? Two mechanisms we gave you in first. First, you get rid of the notion that rich people are rich because they worked for it. You get rid of the notion that poor people are lazy. This debate is about the middle class, right? Because politicians on their side of the house can use rhetoric like saying poor people are lazy, therefore therefore they're still poor, so they cannot have welfare. On our side, the ability to use that rhetoric is diminished because people believe that poor people are poor, not because they're lazy, but due to other random factors that they were out of their control. But second, and this is a better mechanism that you don't touch, it's not just about rich people justifying their own wealth. It's also about fear. The fear is very simple. You as a rich person want to hold on to your wealth, right? Therefore, if you believe that your wealth has been acquired through random factors, those random factors can work against you in the future. So in the past, those random factors might have made you rich, but more random factors in the future might make you poor. Therefore, it is this fear that random factors that are out of your control can make you less rich in the future that gives you an incentive to pay a bit more taxes so you can have a basic social security net, so you can have more money in healthcare and education in the instance that a financial crisis that is out of your control happens. Therefore, it is fear that we speak to, not just the benevolence of rich people. This is a huge impact insofar as you have more money in places like social security, you have more money in places like education, which means that we benefit the most vulnerable people in society when the wealthiest are able to pay more taxes. This is why there is less income inequality in countries like Thailand, where they have religions like Buddhism that emphasize arbitrariness over personal choice in comparison to more capitalistic societies and more individual societies like the place of East Asian culture, as well as cultures like the US. Let's now talk about their mechanism about social movements. Two responses here. One, as I said in my introduction, the prerequisite to social movements existing is the belief that randomness matters, right? Because there is no inertia for you to protest if you believe that the random hand you were dealt through the birth lottery did not oppress you. People are less likely to protest if they themselves think that they're failing because they're not working hard. People are more likely to protest and demand when they think that it is random injustices that are out of control that got them to their poor place in the first place. That's why social movements are likely to exist more on our side of the house. But second, right? Like, I just want you to ask yourself, what is the upshot of their case? Because sure, people are likely to protest once on their house, but protesting once won't get you anywhere. You're unlikely to protest again and again and again, because as we told you in our first speech, there's a cap on working hard. Before I move on, yeah, your PY.
It's not literally that on both sides of the house, people will pick and choose what's better for them. It's that people can have their own individual interpretations of what, for instance, random means. And we're the side which analyzes the structural reasons to decide as to why people have a particular meaning behind randomness.
No, but if people can pick and choose, randomness or individual action just doesn't matter, as I said earlier. Well, getting back to what I said about protest, right? There's a cap on how hard you can work. If you spend all your money towards a social movement and you do all your other personal actions and you still fail, that is when you're going to be demoralized because there's a cap on personal action. But there isn't a cap on randomness, right? Because you cannot be randomly unlucky for the rest of your life. You're going to be randomly unlucky and randomly lucky. That's an incentive for people to have more sustainable protests. Last, let's talk about the individual in society. Understand the weighting I gave to you earlier, which is that failure is more likely to happen than success. So if their worst impact is tokenization of poor people when they succeed, that is less important than how poor people are able to motivate themselves when they fail, because that failure is more likely and failure puts them in a more vulnerable state of mind. On our side of the house, individuals are less likely to quit after they have burned themselves out. Individuals are less likely to overwork themselves beyond their biological limits, because they believe that at a certain point, there's a cap on individual action instead of a world in which you can just work harder and get more success. That is a world that you have in places like China, where you don't go to work from 9 to 5, but you go to work from 9 to 9, 6 days a week. They perpetuate a toxic society where people blame themselves. That is unacceptable. We are proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the DP3 and to conclude the substantive up and the substantive portion of the debate. Overall, welcome the O3.
Thank you. I'll get my notes in order real quick. Okay. Panel, such proposition fundamentally misunderstands this debate. Random factors means you have no influence over it. Yes, that doesn't mean that the chances have to be equal. This is to say that you do not have any influence into over the socioeconomic situation that your family and you were born into. Yet that does not mean that everything you try is a coin toss at the moment you were born into a rich family, because the chance of you succeeding is simply factually bigger. Sam gave you many reasons why this is correct reading of the debate, because it's simply impossible to believe otherwise. And it is not what this narrative currently or has ever looked like or will ever be able to look like. Random factors means you have no influence over it, not that everyone has an equal chance. Proposition needs to engage with what this motion actually looks like, because it is impossible to live in a world where everything is suddenly a coin toss, because there's factors that play into it. Therefore, it is impossible to buy into such proposition reading of the debate, because it would never be possible to begin with. I think they didn't engage with the way of that the CA set this motion to begin with. Let's actually debate the real motion. Firstly, I will engage with their argument on powerful people, then I will engage on the individual motivations and hard work. So firstly, our argument on powerful people, why does it fall off the debate? What they told it, I think this entire argument is uncomparative, but I'll explain to you why. They firstly talked to us about why colonialism and slavery are worse than theirs in the house, because it's easier to justify, because the way that you got into that position was due to your own actions. Firstly, panel, what the proposition needed to prove is that there is a need for justification to begin with. We don't think that that is the case. If you want to oppress other people, you will be able to do so on both sides of the house, either because there wasn't awareness back where people actually come from, or because you simply do not care enough. That means that they needed to prove that you needed the justification. They never did so. Therefore, I think that this is uncomparative. Secondly, we told you that it's even easier to justify on such proposition, because you do not need to seek logic for the justifications that they have for their actions. This is, for example, the God's mandate that Sam talked about in his PUI. It's easy to just say that you got a mandate from God and that is therefore the reason that you justify your actions. So that is a way in which white people would have always justified colonialism for themselves, because they would always have an incentive to do so, because it just fit them better. Therefore, I think that is uncomparative. But thirdly, even if there was need for justification and we lose it, I think they needed to prove why there's the ability for people to hold them accountable. That is to say that it's more likely that they would have covered up colonialism, what slavery actually looked like, since they were thousands and thousands of kilometers away from people that actually could hold them accountable. For example, the Netherlands, when they colonialized Indonesia, why would people actually know about what was going on instead of them just covering it up? Argument false. Then it talked to us about how the rich will be in favor of welfare, of supporting more welfare, etc., for two reasons. Firstly, because randomness might work against them. Firstly, I don't think, like Okay, firstly, I don't think this is correct reading of the debate, as we already explained. But secondly, even if that was the case, they needed to explain that randomness will work against you to the extent that you, if you're a millionaire, for example, will literally need welfare. I think that is incredibly unlikely. Therefore, they needed to prove why the chance that people will think this is likely. But secondly, I don't think it is, because there's simply a positive bias. People are more likely to think they succeed than to think that they will fail, because they simply don't like thinking of themselves as someone that fails. That is to say that people will not be supporting welfare more, because they will not think they will ever need it, even if there is some randomness that plays into it. But thirdly, even if you support welfare more, it will be far more costly than it will ever be able to help you in the long term. Therefore, I think you're more likely to set something on a separate bank account or anything, if anything. Secondly, tell you that you can't self-justify wealth anymore, and therefore you have less political capital. They needed to explain to us why these rich people need political capital to begin with in order to defend themselves. But the moment that they say to you themselves that rich people can make up this policy. Secondly, I think they will always still find ways to justify it, because as they said in their first speech, it's not fully black and white. Okay, then they tell us, yeah, but there's less ability for politicians to call poor people poor, etc. Therefore, it's easier to persuade people on not giving them welfare. Panel, even if there's some more willingness to help minorities, that will not transfer into actual policy on that proposition, because there's many things that people take into consideration when voting. Why is this the tipping point? But secondly, it takes very long to set up this kind of policy. Therefore, need to also sustain it for many years. Impossible. They did not do enough level work here. Let's get into the more important side of this debate, namely on individuals, how this impacts them, and then we create actual bottom-up change. So that proposition tells us a couple of things. They basically tell us that individuals that fail will suffer under that failure more, because they're likely to blame themselves. Panel, firstly, I think most people will not fail, because they set realistic goals for themselves. So there's less need to blame yourself to begin with. It already said in our first speech, so what is failure and what is success is very subjective. People are likely to set that up for themselves. You're not likely to set up something very unrealistic, because you don't want to see yourself as a failure. But secondly, when you do fail, I think it's far worse as a proposition. Firstly, because you have literally no autonomy over your life and your chances. That is terrible, because you simply give all your power out of hands. Secondly, it becomes even worse because there's no perspective of change ever at any point in your life. I think on our side of the house, even if you fail, you know that you can make it better, because it is in your ability to do so. Therefore, dealing with the failure becomes easier. Then that proposition tells us, yeah, but everyone is going to work harder, and therefore people are more likely to overwork. No. Listen to what Ige told you in her first speech. It is how, for example, minorities interpret these kinds of views. So, for example, minorities, because of structural factors and randomness factors being more likely to work against them at the moment that they say that they can never make the change, they're the ones that are likely to work less hard. So on the comparative, they're the group that will work harder. So it's not about every individual working harder and therefore them outcompeting themselves. It's specifically about the minorities now also making an effort, because they know that they could actually reach something. But even if you blame yourself more, I think this is not the most important thing, because it would suck on both sides of the house to fail. And second, it's a short-termist harm at best, because you can try again. I'll take a POI now.
You only have so many personal actions as a minority. You can only work so hard before your body biologically gives up on you. What happens on your after people exhaust those options?
Okay, I'll get into burnouts and such now, because let's get into the most important thing, namely on hard work. If people are more likely to work hard on our side of the house, set realistic goals, achieve those goals, make actual bottom-up change. So proposition tells you that this is very unlikely, because people are likely to burn out. Firstly, no, because most people know their limits, so this is about a very small minority. But note that also within this motion, your success being a consequence of your own personal actions also mean that you can influence that by knowing your limits. So that is also included within this. But secondly, even if people are more likely to burn out, that is short-term harm at best. On the long term, we told you why people are more likely to reflect from this, learn and work harder to prevent this from happening in the future. That means that people on the long term are more likely to learn from their mistakes and therefore are likely to reach their goals in a better way. So proposition just threw around the word burnout and said why people, and just assumed that people can never get over that. I think even the small minority that burns out at least now made an attempt. They learn from that, make an attempt in the future. This means that people are more likely to try out for certain jobs, receive small successes, and for there create bottom-up large-scale change. Why is that the most important thing in this debate? Firstly, we have far more sustainable change, because on contrast, minorities climbing the social ladder is far more likely to be a sustainable long-term impact, because they're more likely to, for example, hire other minorities because they know where they come from and are more willing to give them a chance. These are people that have more capital. Note that this is an entire debate takes place in the developed world where people can just rely on welfare, even if you buy the proposition argument. This is about people, women, now daring to get a job, daring to apply to a better university, people climbing out of their social ladder. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition third. We now move on to the team's concluding reply speeches, and I welcome the opposition reply speaker. Take care.
Thank you. Just getting my timer. Panel, there is never a good justification for oppression. At the end of this debate, proposition tells us they have a slightly worse reason now for colonizers to have colonized. They tell us there's now a worse reason for rich people to hoard wealth. The problem with this is that it's just not comparative. The most terrible things individuals do are done out of selfish reasons. They never showed us why they are able to change these incentives. Colonizers would have colonized anyways because they wanted land, because they wanted resources. They never had a good reason to do it to begin with. I don't understand why to change anything. 2 questions in my speech. Firstly, how does this motion actually play out? And secondly, how does this then impact the most vulnerable groups within society? So firstly, on how this motion plays out. Proposition brings us this idea that what this motion means is that everything is caused by randomness, and that means a 50-50 chance on everything. What we tell you is, sure, maybe you have the fiat to frame what this narrative looks like. However, proposition doesn't have the fiat to frame how this narrative will then play out to individuals, to each unique individual's experiences, because that's what the entire debate is about. What do we tell you? We tell you it's not necessarily about picking and choosing what you like. Rather, it's about the fact that each individual has different lived experiences, but you as a minority have faced systemic oppression, that you understand that structural factors are against you. And at the moment in which you then place this narrative onto these minorities, and you tell them all your success, all your failure is completely out of your hands, it is completely out of your control, it is completely random, their lived experiences will tell them otherwise. Their lived experiences will tell them that structural factors are always staked against them. What we tell you then is that individuals are unlikely to want to further try to be incredibly demotivated. Bowser then comes up and tells us, but all social movements are reliant on the belief that oppression is random. But I want to note something. I think their first speaker, their prime minister, answers this question for Bowser, because the first speaker literally explains that this debate is a sliding scale. It is not that in each world, everything is absolute. So in our world, maybe the dominant narrative is that everything is in your hands, but that doesn't mean minorities don't understand why they're being oppressed, right? Like, I think this still probably occurs. It's a bit of an absurd claim. Okay, moving on to the second question then on on how this impacts minorities. Proposition claims very unrealistic impacts. The first thing they tell us is colonialism would have never happened. The second thing they tell us is now the rich will feel bad about being rich and suddenly be scared of losing their wealth. What did we tell you here? We told you that, once again, this is just incredibly comparative. It's not like in the status quo, Jeff Bezos honestly feels like he's doing good for the world by hoarding wealth. The difference here in our world is very simple. We are able to convince individuals that they do have a chance, that everything in their opportunity, everything they can do is in their own hands. We tell you it is easier in our world to convince minorities to, for instance, continuously go out and protest day after day, even if initially they fail. Because the difference in proposition's world is you can go out and protest for one day, but as soon as you get shut down, if you're told everything is random, you automatically feel like it's never going to work out. Because the problem is, even if everything is caused by random factors, you have structural factors that inhibit you from being able to succeed. The difference in our world is when we tell you that everything is in your hands, even if you fail the first day, you're still told that you should try again because there may be a possibility that you'll succeed the next day. That is the exact reason why the feminist movement was able to secure women for voting rights. That is the exact reason why we're able to have successful social movements that continuously go after day and never give up. The difference then here, what we tell you then is that even if you tell minorities everything is arbitrary, their lived experiences will tell them otherwise. In our world, the narrative fits them better, fits their lived experiences better when we're able to tell minorities that, one, even if you even if you try and you fail, that everything you can still try again. But two, that every time you do succeed, that is because of something you did. In propositions world, even if minorities do succeed, it is ultimately caused by arbitrary factors. It is never something that they actually gain themselves. We tell you once again that we are the side that is able to motivate people to stand up for change. We are the side that is able to allow people to persevere even after they face obstacles. Panel, at the end of this debate, I want you to ask yourself a question. If you are a minority who has been continuously oppressed by systemic issues, which side of the house are you more likely to be motivated in? I think the answer is pretty clear.
I thank the up reply for that speech. And now to conclude both the prop bench and the entire debate, welcome the prop reply.
Hi, I'm audible.
Yes, all's good.
By the end of the op reply, their strategy was saying randomness is not random because individuals interpret. That's already not the burden in this debate. But furthermore, our argumentation was never based on the idea that every decision is 50-50. It's based on the idea that you believe you can succeed because there is a chance. On their side, if everything is based on individual action, you blame yourself, and when you run out of resources, you stop trying. It was never reliant on a statistical figure. They were never properly responding. But we were very generous in this debate, and we took their best at the framing and everything. We're going to consider all of that in the 3 points of adjudication and show why we still win very clearly. One, on motivation. We win this on many layers because all the response came very, very late in op 3, but we're going to engage anyways. One, we tell you that overworking is unique to their side, right? They never prove that working a lot is very good, especially when everyone does it, and therefore your chance of success doesn't change. They never prove that. So burnout is still unique to their side. Secondly, consistent motivation exists on our side. All we heard against us was saying, you don't feel like you have a good chance of succeeding because it's random. We think like if you think it's random, you have an incentive to keep going, right? Because you think there is a shot of you succeeding. On their side, once again, if everything is based on individual action, you're more likely to burn out. To then just assert burnout is short term, I would argue like it's already a huge harm to burnout because it's a huge lack of motivation. Our side is clearly better than the comparative when you have consistent motivation. That's a very easy clash for us to win. But they also never beat us at our best case analysis. We tell you the capacity to succeed in society is the same, and that like the amount of CEO positions doesn't change. So on their side, most people probably still won't succeed, and therefore at the end of the day won't be super satisfied. That's bad. On our side, if you don't succeed, you are more satisfied because you can tell yourself, I was unlucky, it was random, there's nothing I can do. On their side, there's much more self-blame. We never heard engagement. So we already win motivation very easily. But also just on a strategy stance, it's very weird what they're arguing for, because Bowser called us this tension and they didn't actually acknowledge this. Because they're saying corporations are super racist and individuals are never able to succeed. But then they simultaneously say that everyone should work super hard within these systems that are inherently racist. So it's unclear what their end goal is. Like if apparently these corporations are all very, very bad and you don't get to succeed because of natural factors, why is it a good thing that you work super hard in these systems? Their end goal is unclear. Now, at the end of the day, we're able to prove to you why individuals are much more able to succeed, even if they're small goals, things like, for example, getting a good grade, getting a good job, you're still more likely to fail, so therefore consistent motivation is better. We win that. Secondly, on social injustices, let's look at what OP wants to propose, because they say at the very best, the idea that randomness is based on birth. We took them at the very best and say, even if that is true, that means social change happens uniquely on our side. And Bowser flips this explicitly, because we told you on our side, it is only when you believe that there are factors that are random and that cause you problems in status quo, do you actually fix them. Therefore, on our side, there's a unique incentive to fix those things at the point when you fight towards like getting rid of those like inequities. We also give you a very clear weighing in second. We told you that on our side, if you are less likely to succeed because you think there are like, there are like statistical differences in like, how likely you are to succeed, you have an incentive to change that. On their side, if everything is based on hard work, it's much easier to justify, I worked hard, therefore I succeeded, and therefore you don't cause societal problems. So for that reason, even if you buy their framing that for some reason that's this like level of inequality, that randomness comes from birth, that is a world when we actually acknowledge social problems and change them. We also win them very simply by proving that on their side, you have less access to actions, right? So if you exhaust all of your actions because they are very limited on their side, you give up. On our side, there's no cap to how long you can be random, like that, take chances, and therefore you're more likely to consistently fight for social change, which is uniquely important to get long-term change. The biggest impact on our side is historical oppression, and we never heard a good response to what Bowser told you. Bowser told you that because rich people are not inherently evil, they believe that things are justified because of the reasons that we gave you. So on their side, you believe it's okay to oppress because you think you were inherently better because you worked harder. That's a unique mechanism unresponded to. So things like historical slavery are much likely to happen on their side. It's a huge impact they never engage with. That in and of itself wins this clash anyways. 3, equity in society. At the end of the debate, the majority responses to all these metrics were very dismissive. So we get all these impacting through. One, we tell you that public call for equity is much more likely through taxation, right? Because if you believe you succeeded not because of all individual merit, but rather random factors, you care a lot more about things like progressive taxes. Literally no response to any of this. That's already very good in terms of welfare. But secondly, you also want to protect yourself. They say CEOs don't care about welfare. That may be true, but CEOs will then care about, for example, cheaper housing if they get a bit more poor. But the middle class then cares more about things like, for example, welfare. Everyone cares more about those who are under them in a class system because you believe that you could be there one day, much more likely. That's a world that's more equitable and has a safety net for everyone. So for those reasons, we also provide the most vulnerable society a much better. On these three metrics, we've been very clearly go for the proposition. Thank you.
I thank the Prof reply for that speech and indeed everyone for what was truly an enjoyable debate. Once again, congratulations for making it thus far, and yeah, all the best.
Thank you all for the debate.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you for the
Thank you
debate.
so much for the debate.
Thank
It
you,
was a
the
pleasure.
adjudicators, for judging as well.
Slay.
Sorry, Ocom, just a question. Where do we go to deliberate? Or confer? Hello, is anyone from Ocom here? Or tech? Ivan, are you there? Okay, so let me just try to find out where we go to confer.
Hi. We're done, right? Sorry, I had a connection issue. Short
Yes,
there.
we are
Yeah,
done.
so you need the breakout room and everything. Okay. I'm also stopping the live stream.
Thank you.